Hi, I'm Claire Mitchell, QC. Welcome to the Witches of Scotland podcast. I'm a lawyer who specialises in miscarriage of justice cases, and we're bringing you this podcast because we want to tell you about the women who were accused, prosecuted, convicted, and ultimately executed as witches in Scotland.
I'm Zoe Venditozzi, and I'm a writer who's always had an interest in the witches, and I feel that this dark mark against Scotland needs a reckoning.
The campaign Witches of Scotland wants three things. Firstly, a pardon for all those convicted of witchcraft. Secondly, an apology for all those who were accused as witches. And finally, a national monument in recognition of all those who are affected by this terrible miscarriage of justice.
Over the forthcoming weeks, we'll be talking to a whole host of experts about the history and the modern day connections to the Witches of Scotland. Hello and welcome to the Witches of Scotland podcast. Claire, you have made a funny little joke about the number of which episode it is today, haven't you?
I'm now even ashamed that you're saying it's a joke, but it's episode 57, just like Heinz.
57?
57
wow.
Varieties of us.
It's thank God there's actually not 57 varieties of us. That's amazing though, 57 episodes.
We're coming up to the big 6-0.
Do we retire at that point? Or is it like modern life now where you don't actually get to retire, you just keep going until you peg it? Yeah.
We've already engaged with so many other people and want them to come on the podcast that
Goodness gracious. It's good though, isn't it, that there's so many people that are working within this field. Who would have thought there'd be so many experts? But it's brilliant. And today's episode is no different. So before we get on to our guest of the day, guest of the pod, Claire, just wondering, what's happening in the news?
Well, there's quite a lot going on in the news. First of all, there's an event coming up that I am so looking forward to.
Oh yes, yeah.
Really excited about. Tell us about that. So you tell us what's in the news.
So I Write is a book festival in Glasgow. It's Glasgow's literary festival. And that's just about to kick off on the 6th of May. That starts Friday, 6th of May. I think the event that I'm chairing, the first one, is the first event of the festival. And that's with Annie McManus, better known as Annie Mac, the DJ, who's now also a writer. So she's doing her first novel, which is called Mother, Mother, on the Friday night. But then a few weekends after that, on Saturday, the 21st of May, we will be, I think this is quite exciting actually, if it all works technically, we are going to be recording basically a live podcast episode with fantastic writer Jenny Fagan about her new book, Hex, which we know lots of our listeners have had an interest in. So Claire, what's the book about? Because you've read it, I haven't read it yet. I've been holding off on it, so I'm reading it nearer the time.
So the book is about the interaction between a woman accused of witchcraft centuries ago and a modern woman. I don't want to give too much away.
Yeah, you don't want to give too much away. And it's quite a brief book, isn't it?
It is.
A novella.
A novella.
So I don't know if it's been described as a novella, and I'm not sure. I always, when I'm doing creative writing workshops, that's something we always discuss about the size of them, and there is like a word count for them. But it's a really beautiful looking little book, apart from anything else. It's got a really lovely cover. It's part of that new series where writers reimagine sort of historical things. So like there's a Denise Mina one called Rizzio about the murder of Rizzio. So that's part of the same series, I believe. But the Jenny Fagan one then is about an accused witch based on a historical figure, right?
Yes, based on a historical figure in Edinburgh. And it's, I don't want to give too much.
Yeah, don't, because you don't want to spoil it for readers. It's meant to be a great book, and I know you've enjoyed it.
I did. I really, really enjoyed it. And I think anyone that's listening to this podcast, it would be exactly the sort of thing that they would do as well. Jenny's
a good writer, and I mean, probably listeners are familiar with her other books like The Panopticon and The Sunlight Pilgrims, so they would be familiar with it. So I'm really looking forward to speaking to Jenny. She's really interesting, and I think that she'll be a good guest. So that's happening in Glasgow on the 21st of May. We'll put up links on our Twitter and so on, so you can buy tickets for that one. But that should be a good one. Then we can have a nice chat. And then if people come to that one, we can have a chat with you afterwards if you fancy. Mind you might see us on stage and think, oh God, don't want to speak to those two idiots. Well, they might not say that about you, Claire, but they might just say that.
They'll say it's best to leave them to themselves.
But we will be hanging about if people want to have a chat. So that's on Saturday, 21st of May, and it's from 6:30 to 7:30 at night, and promises to be a good event. But Claire, apart from that in the news, have there been any news stories that have been of interest to you?
Yeah, well, I saw a news story that caught my eye, and it was about a woman who was being penalised for the way that they were making money. And it really reminded me of the stories we've heard about in the past about women who were brewers, who were making a little bit of money, who were then separated from that work by men taking over the job of brewing, and women weren't able to make any money that way. And I saw this, it was a really, really sad thing. And I'm looking from the BBC website on this about this woman from Egypt who was a TikTok star. You know how I love my TikTok, Zoe, for human trafficking. Now, you read that headline and you think, oh my God, some woman has got involved in the trafficking of other human beings and has made profit from them. How horrible and how disgusting. But you read on, and this was a person on TikTok, a person who was gaining followers on TikTok and therefore maybe being able to get some money by advertising and stuff like that. She had gained about 900,000 followers on TikTok, posting her videos of lip syncing to songs and dancing. And when she was doing that, she was saying, look, you could do this too. You could earn money too. Well, she was arrested in April of 2020 because inviting women to join her and also to say that they could make money by broadcasting live videos was, in the views of Cairo's Economic Court, quote unquote, violating family values and principles, and they sent them to 2 years in prison and fined them the equivalent of about $16,000. So what happened was they were then acquitted in January 2021 and released. And after they were acquitted and released on appeal, they were then prosecuted for the more serious charge of human trafficking. These women were accused of, inverted commas, using girls in acts contrary to the principles and values of Egyptian society with the aim of gaining material benefits. Unfortunately, one of the girls was convicted and she was sentenced to 6 years in jail, and another, who wasn't present, was jailed for 10 years in absentia. So what happened was she has now been granted a retrial. I'm not really sure how that works, but essentially what's happening is young women that are getting involved in social media and TikTok and saying that you can do this too are being penalised in this way. And a lot of people have been, as you can imagine, tweeting about it and upset about it and saying that what's happening here is that women are being controlled, their way of making money is being controlled, and it's simply another way to control how women live and how women act. This woman wasn't promoting anything improper. All she was doing was dancing and lip syncing.
It says later on in the article that although she was granted a retrial, the same court found her guilty on Monday. So it's given her a 3-year sentence and fined her another 200,000 Egyptian pounds, which is equivalent to $10,800. So she has been jailed again.
It's so
That's horrifying.
You know, you really worry about what that's saying when they were saying that they were acting contrary to the principles of the values of Egyptian society with the aim of gaining material benefits. And there's been absolute uproar about it. And I'm so glad that there has been uproar about it, because it seems that even doing things which you would imagine nobody would argue with, dancing, lip syncing, no, that's contrary to what society wants of these young women, and they're being silenced for doing this. So I just thought I'd flag that up just as a really, really sad example of how modern day social media can interact with very different and old values, and these poor young women are getting caught up in it. Very sad.
Yeah, and the reason that links obviously to our campaign is the idea that, you know, women should kind of stay in their lane. And I know that the witch trials are not an exclusively, you know, gendered issue, but you do get this sense that society, because of patriarchy and because of thousands of years of patriarchy, doesn't like it when, or certain parts of society don't like it when women find some way of being independent and making their own money. You and I have talked about this before, and you mentioned this to me earlier, that we need to get somebody on to talk about the idea of alewives.
Yes.
Because when we first started the campaign yonks and yonks ago, that was something that we talked about initially, was the idea that alewives were then accused of being witches because men realised they could make money. But then we discovered there's some historians that don't really agree with that. So we need to get somebody on to sort of talk about the...
Definitely do. Shout out to anyone who's listening to this. Knows about the alewives and or disagrees with it, because we know that there is disagreement on this issue about whether or not they were the kind of precursor ideas to women that would be described as witches, with the cauldrons, with the broomsticks, that were being ostracised by society because men wanted to take over the means of production of brewing. So give us a shout out if you know anything about that or know anyone that might be able to speak to us on that. We'd really love to hear from you. In other news, I'm really delighted to say that earlier on this week we spoke to Mary from the Calder Witch Hunt, and she told us about this brilliant community project about the 17th century witchcraft accusations in Calder. And they're doing this project to understand their history and to commemorate those affected. So it was a great new project, and they have a lot of exciting ideas. We're not going to share those with you just now because they're in the planning, but we'll update you when we know more. Follow them on Twitter. They're on Twitter at Calder Witch Hunt, and no doubt you can keep up with what they're doing.
And Calder spelled Calder for those people out with Scotland that might not know that one. So Calder Witch Hunt, all one word. That's cool. Good. It's so interesting to see all the different community projects that are being done. It's really fascinating. Yeah, I saw another one that I'm not going to go into detail about just now because I want to talk to them and maybe speak to them, get them on the podcast. But one of our friends shared something in her local community where there's a memorial stone that's been put up in the last wee while, and there's a launch in the next couple of weeks for that one with the names of those locally that had been accused and convicted. So that's really interesting to see as well. It's great because it just means that, you know, as you move around Scotland and people live in Scotland, you know, that, you know, they can engage with what their history was, and these names hopefully will be remembered.
Yeah, it's so exciting. We've also asked the Calder Witch Hunt to come on the podcast too at some point in the future, and they've agreed to do that. So we'll be able to get the stories from them direct. Yeah, I saw the one that you're talking about, Zoe, and I'm really, really keen to find out about them as well. Is that a stone that was made?
It's not exactly a gravestone, but it's a stone, like it looks like a big bit of stone that's got all the names carved into it. So that looks really interesting. But I'm going to find out more about that, and then we'll talk about that in maybe the next episode. I've got some more details about it. It's good to see it happening, though. That's great.
Anything else, finally, Zoe?
Well, this is really nice, actually. We want to give a big shout out to our lovely listener, Helen Morrison, who we met on Twitter, and she's been in touch. And her name on there, her handle is Helen M. Walking. And Helen's bio says, if it's all about green space communities, health and women, I'm in, which sounds good to us. Well, her friends and family surprised her with a Witches of Scotland cake. So we just wanted to join in and say a very happy birthday too. And now I want a cake like that. It was cool. Looks really good. You can see it on Twitter. Really nice.
Yeah, happy birthday, Helen. It's an absolutely fantastic cake. And I think maybe fairy cakes for us. Lots and lots of fairy cakes with like Witches of Scotland W's on the top.
Oh, that's good. It's morning just now, and I've only had a cup of tea and a banana because I don't have any bread. I'm totally starving. Now I just want a massive big slab of cake.
I think we deserve a cake. Are there any bakers out there that could help us make a Witch Scotland cake?
I can actually bake myself, but my oven doesn't work properly. I know, blame the poor, the tools. I used to actually have, believe it or not, a pop-up cake business, like a pop-up tea room, a vintage tea room, but I haven't baked a cake since then. I think it just put me off so thoroughly. It hasn't stopped me from eating them, obviously, but I just don't make them anymore.
Listen, I think, never mind shout out to anyone else, you should be making us a cake, Zoe.
Honestly, I need to get my oven replaced. It's a gas oven and I just cannot get any cakes to rise in it. It's just rubbish. Anyway, that's a very domestic complaint. Right. So moving on to our final segment here. Who are we going to be remembering this week, Claire?
Well, because earlier this week we spoke to the people from the Calder Witch Hunt, I thought I'd touch on a few people that were accused of witchcraft in that area. Now, when hopefully we would have them on, we'll get them to speak in much more detail about this, but I thought it'd be a good idea to flag up some names just now. So the information that we've obtained so far was obtained from a website called Kirk of Calder all one word, Kirk of Calder, which you can look at for a lot more details. We're just flagging up the names and some information, but that will give you a lot more on what was happening in Calder at the time and who the relevant people were. What we do find out from looking up that website is in 1644, a new minister arrives in Calder, and he is described as a zealot. He has got a zealous crusade against witches. So it's a great surprise, Zoe, but see if people turn up looking for witches, guess what they keep finding?
Is it witches?
It is. It's not cakes, sadly. They find witches. So Mr. Hugh Kennedy, who was the minister from 1643 to 1660, he began his career in Calder.
Made the name for himself.
Exactly, looking out. And he found almost immediately Agnes Bishop, a poor woman who was detained in the toll booth at Linlithgow and was brought back to Calder after trial. And she confessed to being, inverted commas, a common charmer and heinous and notorious witch. And the records tell us that she was executed as a witch. Very sad. Interestingly there that she was described as a common charmer and a witch, those being separate things. Doing spells that weren't associated with the devil was charming, but doing bad associated with the devil meant that you were a witch. So there were lots of people around that were doing spells that weren't accused of witchcraft. And that's more akin to what we have as our modern day ideas of witches. Anyway, the next person we have some record of isn't actually a person that was convicted himself, but it was his wife. And this is a man called David Aikman. And there's a record in the Kirk Session records which says that he paid 100 merks to defray expenses incurred in the trial, imprisonment and execution of his wife. Think about that. That poor man had his wife taken from him, accused of witchcraft. So Mrs. Aikman, we sadly don't know her first name, was accused of witchcraft, killed as a witch, and then the money was laid at his door.
And it's just his name that's actually written down. So it's not even the woman that was accused. So we don't know what happened to her. She may have, does it say here? No, it is. It's money for the execution. So we know that the wife died. And well, died just sounds so passive, was executed, but we don't know her name or anything at all about her. It's just about the money. And it's like Judith Gorman said many episodes ago, and we're going to be having her back on hopefully soon, follow the money. That gives you so much more of an insight than the records do. And Claire, you've said quite rightly that, we say that there's 4,000 that have been accused, but there's likely to be many more who suffered who aren't written down, like this woman.
Yeah, not only this woman who isn't written down, but you've got her partner who suffered as well. And that's the thing, when we say 4,000 accused, you think, 4,000. But it always reminds me of what Professor Goodair said, which was, although there were however many accused and executed, the ramifications of that and how many people would have been involved in it and how many people would know about it and how many people would be affected by it in a country of only 900,000 would be much, much more.
That's crazy.
And those people are never included in the numbers. The last person that we want to remember today is a woman called Jean Anderson. And she was a woman who wasn't accused of being a witch, strangely, but was warned that if she kept doing what she was doing, she was going to be accused of witchcraft. And in 1644, the Kirk Sessions of September say that Jean Anderson made public satisfaction in sackcloth for charming. So the public satisfaction, I think, is like public interest, or like she's doing her community.
She's been humiliated publicly, that dressed her in sackcloth to make a fool of her. Because I've read things before about, not necessarily about accusations of witchcraft, but in that sort of time of people being made to sit on a stool in the church.
Yeah.
Like for public humiliation purposes.
Exactly.
So you get the public satisfaction of her being humiliated. God's sake.
Exactly, that's the public satisfaction. Very happily, we've moved away from the idea that public satisfaction in relation to a crime is humiliation. We have kept the idea that people commit crimes might do work for the community and for community service, but that public satisfaction of humiliation has gone. So,
although, I mean, I don't approve of public satisfaction, obviously, in that way. However, I can think of one or two people in London at the moment who I would quite like to have in sackcloth.
could you?
Although I think because they've got no shame, that it wouldn't make any difference to them anyway, because that whole thing is on the axis of shame of the community admonishing you by thinking that you're lesser than them sort of morally, and that then changing your behavior. But I think if you don't actually experience any shame about all the absolutely appalling things you've done, the lies you've told, that you don't actually get, doesn't make any difference anyway. Sorry, that was a small sideways rant there.
Just want to say that we are in favour of parties and cakes, but not all parties and cakes.
Yeah, that's good, Claire. That was like, have I got news for you?
Not really. So we remember today people that were accused. Jeannie Anderson made public satisfaction in sackcloth for charming, and the minister made certification to her that if she ever should be tried to use charming hereafter, she should be held to be a witch. So he wasn't having even charming in his jurisdiction, this new man in town, this Hugh Kennedy. So he was warning people, even that were involved in charming, which was generally thought to be a benign thing that wasn't involved with witchcraft or the devil, he wasn't having it.Moving on from Jean Anderson, also in 1644, this minister, Hugh, was working hard for his money. This was one that, in fact, is a happy ending. And this is a register of the Privy Council, we understand, in December of 1644, which notes a complaint by a woman called Margaret Thompson in Calder against the minister of the parish. So Margaret is complaining about Hugh Kennedy and saying that he had her walking her the space of 20 days naked and having nothing on her but sackcloth, under a charge of witchcraft. Also, that she had laid in the stocks and kept separate from all the company and worldly comfort, nor could she see any end to her misery by lawful trial. So basically, she was thrown up into some kind of place of confinement, kept in sackcloth for 20 days, and she'd still not received her charge, i.e. they'd not said what witchcraft she had been doing. And a complaint was made, thankfully, no doubt on behalf of Margaret Thompson, who couldn't have done anything by herself while she was in custody, saying that she was being kept remanded in these ways. And the Lord brought the minister before them, and they, bringing no charges at that time forthcoming, ordained her to be liberated. So what's happened there is Margaret Thompson has been taken in, she's been remanded somewhere, she's been stripped naked and only given sackcloth. She'd been kept in for 20 days, kept away from everyone else. I mean, can you imagine that? Not knowing what your fate was going to be, not being able to eat for 20 days, and then being let out because somebody had got in contact with the Privy Council, forced Hugh to go before the Privy Council, and them not to have been able to brought up the goods to see that she was guilty of witchcraft, and they had to let her out. So we end on a bit of a good story there, but she wouldn't show up as an accused person and wouldn't show up as a convicted person either. Again, that's another person whose name wouldn't show up in these numbers. So we remember Agnes Bishop, David Aikman's wife, Mrs. Aikman, Jean Anderson, and Margaret Thompson are people who were accused but not witches.
Okay. Now, today's episode is very interesting. It's with somebody who, again, we've met through Twitter, who's spoken about, and the reason we got in touch with them is because he wrote an article about whether it was a good idea to issue apologies for historical wrongs. And so we thought it'd be worth getting him on to have a wee chat with him about that. So our guest today is Dr Jan Machielsen, and he is a historian working in the fields of early modern cultural, religious and intellectual history. He's written about lots of early modern intellectuals, including de Montaigne and Cesare Baronio. And he, at the moment, I think, is in Rome researching something to do with the Catholic Church, which is quite interesting. So he's written a lot about witch trials and things like that. and he is interested in various areas that kind of cross over. So he's interested in the witch hunts in the French Basque country as well. So not just, his area is not necessarily Scottish witchcraft, but about sort of a broader European story, which is really interesting. He's had tons of publications. There's loads of stuff that you can look at there, and obviously teaches at Cardiff University. But if you want to follow him on Twitter, his Twitter handle it's Dr Jan Machielsen, right? I'm going to spell that because it's obviously not straightforward, as you can hear by the way that I am murdering the pronunciation. So it's Dr Jan, Jan, and then it's Machielsen. But we'll tweet that obviously out with us with the episode for the podcast. But he's a fascinating guest. So without any further ado, welcome to the show, Jan. Hello, and we are delighted to introduce to the podcast this week Dr. Jan Machielsen. What is your background, and can you maybe explain what it is that you do and how it is that we came into contact with each other?
Okay, well, I am a senior lecturer at Cardiff University. I have written about many different aspects of witchcraft and witchcraft history. I've written about a demonologist, so a learned author who wrote a book about witchcraft and magic and why witches should be burned, a man called Martin Del Rio, who was from Antwerp in the Low Countries, but also, as his name suggests, with a Spanish background. I've written a short book about witchcraft historiography, about how 19th century historians approach the topic, and I'm currently working on a history of a witch hunt in the French Basque country. So this is in the complete southwest of France. In 1609, it saw a particularly vicious bout of witch hunting. So I've come at witchcraft from many different angles. I've also written a little bit about James VI and First, but I am not a Scottish witchcraft historian. Nevertheless, my name is Jan Machielsen, and I think, sometimes the computer systems in the UK think I'm Scottish, and perhaps for that reason I was approached if I could please write an article, an op-ed about Nicola Sturgeon's recent apology to the Scottish witch hunts, and I had some thoughts about that, and then the three of us sort of corresponded about that online, and you guys very kindly invited me to come on your podcast to talk about it some more. So yeah, here I am.
We're
Thank
delighted.
you for having me.
Thank you for coming. We're delighted to speak to historians and researchers from any area of the witch research universe. So it doesn't just have to be Scottish witch hunt experts or researchers or historians or whatever, because it's interesting. There's commonalities, obviously, and big differences between all the different areas, which hopefully we'll get on to talk about a little bit more. But what was the main thrust of your op-ed piece that you wrote about the apology, if you don't mind summarising that?
Well, my main point that I always try and make to my own students, I teach a year 3 class on the early modern witch hunt as well, is that traditionally historians, especially in the 19th century, but sort of up to, say, the 1960s, 1970s, have depicted the history of the witch hunt as a story of irrationality, of bigotry, of prosecution that happened in the past, and that sort of like highlighted about how much better we are now living in the present. And I've always been very skeptical about that narrative, and everything I've written in different ways has sort of like confirmed to me that, the people living in the present are not better than the people living in the past. And that the types of prosecution, the types of bigotry, the types of superstition, etc., whatever label we want to use, we can find that in the present as much as in the past. And for that reason, I'm very, very sympathetic to the idea of witchcraft memorials. I like the idea of creating spaces where we can remember past injustices, but also as spaces where we can reflect about, the unkind things that we might think ourselves, about, foreigners or people of, minorities or sexual minorities, etc. And I like the idea of a pardon, like the ones that you're advocating for, because again, like it creates an opportunity for us to reflect about injustices, and not just injustices in the past, but also hopefully injustices in the present as well. So my concern that I expressed in my article was with the idea of an apology. And that might seem strange, but I was concerned that an apology by, say, the Scottish state to its, the witches that it unfairly, unjustly, executed, might actually do the opposite of what, these memorials and these pardons might achieve, namely, essentially by saying, well, that's justice done. We have, the Scottish state is responsible for the witch hunt. It has now said, sorry, we won't do it again. And I don't think that is what the early modern witch hunt is about. I think the witch hunt tells us something much deeper and much darker about all of us, and that therefore just demanding apologies from a number of institutions as a form of pinning blame just on them actually sort of like harms the long-term cause of using the early modern witch hunt to sort of like foster inspiration or foster ideas about injustices then and now.
So do you mean that by the state offering an apology, it sort of lets ordinary people off the hook so they don't shine a light on their own potential for horrific behaviour and unkind behaviour? Right, I see what it is that you mean. Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder if that sort of speaks to whether or not people feel themselves as actually being represented by government as well. If you feel like the government, like I personally feel, I don't think it's anywhere near even remotely perfect. I don't think any human system really can be, but they're there. I see them as being working for me and other people that vote. So I think that I want the state to act out things that I think are really important on a human level. But if you maybe didn't view the state as being like a machine that should kind of be controlled by the populace, then I can see why that would let you off the hook. But I think Claire and I are always bringing it back to, although it was mostly women that were accused, women themselves were very involved in accusing other women and pushing forward other women. And that we always see the links between what happened then as being very much alive now. I mean, obviously we don't strangle and burn people, but we still have that same drive to other and pick on the vulnerable. So we see the apology as kind of a tool to shine a light on us as a nation and also shine a light forward so we can be aware of that and behave sensibly and sensitively. But I can see what your point is now. I see that more clearly.
Can we assure you, Jan, that we're not stopping with the apology? We're not going, right, job done, that's it, finished, pack up, Zoe, we're finished. I get your point, and it's an interesting one. It's like, if the state apologises, are we now all off the hook? Can we just say it was the state that did this? And I mean, part of the reason when I first thought about the state apology, part of the reason that I thought about it was I wanted people to understand that the witchcraft trials weren't being mobs of people just giving some kind of community justice. And it wasn't religious prosecutions either. They were, in fact, endorsed, supported and paid for, in part, at least in Scotland, by the state. So I wanted people to understand that they were secular prosecutions and that the state were the people who were giving out the commissions in the form of the Privy Council to say, yes, you can prosecute a person. So when you and Zoe were just talking there, I was reflecting that I felt like I was back in the 90s doing my honours in jurisprudence, because I studied law and the state and what it meant to be an individual in the state and how you viewed yourself. And it is quite funny the different ways that people view the state. I do view the state as both representing us, but also being separate from us, being a separate entity. I'm interested in your idea that what we must be clear about if a state apologises is the narrative behind that. Now, we know the First Minister only had a very little period of time on International Women's Day to speak and wasn't going to tread the whole history of the witchcraft trials. So she highlighted a part of the witchcraft accusations that related to misogyny, because at the same time we're in Scotland bringing in laws in respect of making misogyny a particular aggravation to crime, which will allow people to be convicted of crimes aggravated by misogyny and also given higher sentences. So obviously, in reflecting upon the history of Scotland, she's picked out issues of misogyny. But I imagine what you think is it's a lot more complex than just the idea of misogyny.
Yes, well, you already discussed that, right? One of my mentors when I was a PhD student at Oxford was Little Roper, whose work has been really instrumental in pointing out the role that young mothers played in accusing older women, particularly women beyond sort of childbearing age, lying inmates, for instance, who could no longer have children, but then could be seen to be envious of the young mother's good fortune, so that when then a child would fall ill, like their envy would be a very obvious explanation for witchcraft accusation. So it is those types of behaviors of individuals that for me are really important in explaining how the witch hunt happened. The other thing that I think is really interesting about what you both said, and which someone also pointed out to me on Twitter, is sort of that, when Nicola Sturgeon apologizes, she apologizes for the whole of Scotland, for the Scottish people, as well as for the Scottish state. I can see that. I don't think she actually sort of said that. And that's sort of like where the issues of narratives do come in. But you're absolutely right, Claire, that, obviously a First Minister is only able to speak for a few minutes and cannot condense, 60, 70 odd years of witchcraft historiography into a very, very short piece. And also that piece then has to have a wider significance for all the other things that she wants to say, because if she were to devote her speech on International Women's Day solely to the issue of apologizing to witches, well, then there would be another problem there too, wouldn't there? So yeah, no, I see that this issue is difficult. For me, the advantage of monuments, say, or pardons is because sometimes they're not accompanied by text. All right, it's just sort of like, and therefore that allows for discussion and it allows for ambiguity. We still don't really, despite all the work that we've done as historians for decades, we still don't really understand why one person was accused of witchcraft and not another. We can explain sort of like why a particular person was accused, but what is completely lost to us is, partly because of the sources, is why someone else, another, say, older woman, who also acted as say, a lying inmate, or who also had a quarrel with her neighbors, why she wasn't accused. There's that we still don't know. And having a official sort of like narrative, as it's like, well, this is the official Scottish version of why the witch hunts happened. Well, I just had some reservations about that. And I should say that I also have sort of reservations about that because of the project that I'm currently doing myself on the witch hunt in the Basque Country, where there are no sort of official versions of the Basque witch hunt, but the versions that local historians propagate about the Basque witch hunt are very problematic, in my view, because they're this idea of we found a foreign culprit and we can blame them and therefore, sort of like let all the Basques off the hook is very much part of their story. In both the French and the Spanish Basque Country, you have local historians, local Basque historians sort of say as well, it's Spanish inquisitors, it's French judges who've come in and who've started hunting witches. And this is then seen as an injustice inflicted on all the Basques. And there you then don't have any reflection on the fact that actually, if you look at the long history of witchcraft prosecutions in the Basque Country, it's quite clear that, these witch hunts are never just sort of like inflicted on the Basques from the outside, but it's very easy to sort of see why people might want to sort of like create a narrative like that. And so for that reason, I think it is important that whenever we create narratives, that we reflect on what the purpose is that they serve. And if it is a narrative in which the Scottish First Minister encourages us to sort of like reflect on our own behavior in the present, then that is, for me, and obviously I'm speaking here more as a human being than as a historian, then for me, then that is a really sort of like noble act. If it achieves the opposite, where it's like, oh, well, the Scottish Kirk or the Scottish state has now apologized for this wrong, and therefore I have to bear no responsibility, then that's the opposite. And that's really what I was trying to warn people about in my piece.
And there's no doubt there is an issue with that sort of thinking, like when it's generally when we get negative feedback from people, I'm going to call it that politely, that they say, well, what's it got to do with me? It happened hundreds of years ago. And they're not terribly self-reflective about it. They don't say, geez, this could happen again, which is why we always link it to the cases that are happening in certain parts of the world. There are ongoing modern day witchcraft accusations, and that can sometimes end in death, and do end in death. There's been a few recently, I think in Nigeria, that's been brought to light by Leo Igwe, who is a campaigner right across, I think, the continent of Africa. But I think he's done a lot of work recently in Nigeria and Malawi in particular. But I think that it's something that maybe also is slightly gendered, or very gendered, in that it tends to be it's negative feedback generally from men. And that I think as a woman, this woman anyway, moving through the world, I don't think I would ever for a second think that we are any better than our forebearers were, because I see it time and time and time again. You either get it directly or you can see it indirectly to other women. And I was sort of laughing today when you tweeted and said, oh, look, I've had a few, thoughtless comments. And I was kind of like, yeah, I am familiar with the thoughtless commenter. I've kept being tagged like a couple of weeks after the apologies happened by a couple of men on Twitter that are just not letting it go. They're like dogs with bones, and they keep coming back and going, look at the bone again. Look at it again. You're still wrong 2 weeks later. And I'm kind of like, I don't give a shit what you think. I don't care. This is something that I feel strongly about. And I think as a woman, you have to either go, I don't care and I'm going to keep going, or you have to put your head down. And I think that must have been to an extent what it's always been like for women, but they maybe in the days of the witch trials, they wouldn't have had the facility to be able to say, well, I'm standing up against you. The only power probably they could have derived was by picking on somebody else, I would imagine. I mean, certainly I don't at all, Claire and I come back to this again and again and again, when women, and it is women generally that say this, say, oh, they were standing up to the patriarchy and they were accused because they were feisty. Claire and I was like, no, you don't understand. But women colluded with that because that's the way the patriarchal structure works. If you want to drive power, particularly in those days, you're working with the boys against the other women. So I think that's something that we keep coming back to, and it's quite unpopular in certain camps of society. But I would say it's changing, and I think more and more people are kind of getting on board, because we have people like yourself on who say, well, here's a facet of history that I know a lot about, and then people listen to it and they go, oh, okay, that's not what I thought. I'll have a think about that, But I'm curious about your work on James, the 1st and 6th, because we reference him a lot, but I don't know how many experts, Claire, we've had on that have done much work on him in particular.
Well, let me just sort of say that my favorite fact about James, a fact that very few people know, is that he not only wrote a treatise against witches, he also wrote a treatise against smoking. Yes.
We didn't get everything wrong, obviously.
Yeah, he wrote a counterblast to tobacco in 1604, I think, when he just arrived in England. And he seems to have used smokers in very much the same way as he used witches. He styled himself as a healer of the body, the social body of the state, as it were. So, this is a very, very standard way of thinking about the relationship between a ruler and the state. Sort of like he also sort of describes England as his bride and he himself as the husband and that sort of thing. So here he styles himself as a healer, and he warns against the heathenish, as he calls it, the heathenish practice of smoking, and sort of like, well, it's the Indians in the New World that smoke, and we might as well sort of like worshipping the devil as they do. So please don't smoke. And also, if you smoke, then you end up stinking very much like a witch, I think. So there are lots of very interesting parallels between the way that James, discusses witches and the way that he discusses smokers. And one of my students at the moment is writing her undergraduate dissertation, trying to sort of like do a sort of systematic comparison between the two depictions. So yeah, he's a very eccentric figure, James, and we need to sort of acknowledge that, sort of like we need to understand him in his own terms rather than think like, oh well, in some sense he's ahead of the time, and one of the first anti-smoking campaigners, and in other times he's very much sort of like not on the side of the angels. But yeah, the way that he seems to use witches and smokers is very much the same in the sense that he seems to have used both to represent his divine kingship. Let's put it that way. The fact that the devil could not harm him as he was crossing over the sea to return to Scotland, showed to James that he was really a divinely anointed king who was protected by God against the devil and the devil's allies. So there are parallels that I think people are not aware of.
Fascinating.
I know. I'm going to call him James VI of Scotland, who wrote Demonology and also a renowned anti-smoker. I think that's maybe just, and some people go, was he a renowned anti-smoker? Yes, he was.
I wonder if it's partly because he had problems smoking. Was he not very dribbly?
What?
Ooh.
I think that James was renowned for dribbling loads. He was really dribbly.
Oh yeah, there was something about him drooling. It's been one of the things that have been used in English historiography to sort of discredit James as a foreign king. The way in which James has been represented in historiography is also just generally really interesting, because there is always that sort of sense like, oh well, James was very into witches, and then he moved to England, the land of civilization, and then he realized that witches were not really gonna sell it there. And of course, those types of narratives are also sort of really very problematic, in which because they seem to create an image of England as being much more civilized than Scotland, which and all of those types of narratives for me are problematic.
Yeah, they go on as problematic today in 2022. Let me tell you, as Scots, I think that is an ongoing narrative that we're heathens up here to a certain extent in certain quarters. But let's not open that particular Pandora's box. So you mentioned before about the Basque region and the official narrative that's there. So are you researching that at the moment then?
I'm writing a book about a witch hunt that happened in the first decade of the 17th century. And one of the judges involved, a Bordeaux judge, so definitely a Frenchman, although he originally, his ancestry is actually Basque, but he never quite acknowledges that. A Bordeaux judge called Pierre de Lancre goes to the Basque country and prosecutes probably around 80 witches, but we don't quite know how many people die. But he says he either banished or executed between 60 and 80. So, 80 then seems like a reasonable upper limit. And he writes a book about it. We've seen that witch hunt through the eyes of Pierre de Lancre, through the eyes of that judge as a result, because he's been our primary source. And he's very proud of what he did. And the reason why he wrote this book is because he wanted to tell the world about it. But at the same time, that then sort of creates quite a problematic narrative, as I mentioned, a narrative where you have a witch hunt, imposed on an innocent territory, the Basque country, by this outsider. And the truth of the matter is that, the Basques, the local magistrates, invited him in. They petitioned the royal court for an outside judge to come in. I've been to the archives in Bayonne, which is the main town in the French Basque country, and you can see that they've been sort of like very happily sort of like, hunting witches on their own for about 6-7 years before Pierre de Lancre comes in. And that in some ways, Pierre de Lancre then is a very convenient scapegoat in a way that witches are scapegoats. Sort of like we can just put all the blame on Pierre de Lancre, and then no one else has to carry any responsibility for who's responsible for that witch hunt. And I think that's perhaps also then explains sort of like where I was coming from when I was writing my op-ed in the Conversation about Nicola Sturgeon's apology.
Yeah, don't let us off the hook by the apology. We're still not off the hook, and the
No.
weren't off the hook. Are there other interesting narratives around witch accusations in different countries? Are there any other ones that you might highlight for us?
Well, so as a Dutch person originally, so as I said, computer systems in this country might think I'm Scottish, but I'm Dutch originally, and I've been happily living in the UK since 2006. But there is very much the narrative of the Netherlands as this beacon of progress, which some people might be familiar with. But in early 19th century history, even entitled the first, and this is like the first Dutch history of, and the subtitle is A Contribution to the Glory of the Fatherland, in which it sort of essentially highlights the fact that whereas like people in Catholic Belgium were very happily continuing on burning witches, we rational Dutch people, we stopped burning witches before everyone else did. And that is true to some extent, but also false, if you sort of zoom in. And it's quite clear that witchcraft suspicions and witchcraft accusations, and actually also, an important factor in all of these stories across Europe, actual illegal witch lynchings, all of these things continued in the Dutch Republic as it was then, just as they continued in Scotland and Ireland and wherever. In that sense also, even though it's very much the opposite of maybe the Basque narrative or the Scottish narrative, but it's also a very problematic narrative. The German narrative is also just really interesting, sort of like the early 19th century witchcraft historians very much used the narrative of the witch hunt in the same way as 19th century Dutch historians did, namely to sort of like point to the massive amount of progress that had been made. So Germany, as both of you will know, was very much the eye of the storm, where when it came to witches, sort of like half the people in the witch hunt who were killed, died in Germany. But in the 19th century, Germany was recently unified. It had these gleaming new industries. It had the first proper research universities. It had, with Leopold von Ranke, it had sort of the founder of modern history. And these stories were then told. The witch hunt was used in the 19th century to just show how far Germany had come as a country. And then, of course, 2 world wars later, the history of Germany and the German witch hunt looks very different. You have the idea of Germany as there's something incredibly irrational about Germany, something superstitious, something bad about Germany. And lots of German witchcraft historians have essentially been sort of like writing their work with the idea of refuting that thesis in mind, particularly because that thesis is very much a false thesis. We know that witch hunting happened in Germany because, as I already mentioned in my conversation piece, most of Germany was not united. Most of Germany was very small states, very weak oversight. Local judges could do whatever they wanted. And that's why there were so many people executed there. So it's very much the opposite of a Holocaust, the German witch hunt. But nevertheless, like that oppression is there. And in Britain, the first witchcraft historians, Hugh Trevor Roper, Norman Cohn, they served in the British Army in World War II. So when they were writing about witch hunting, they very much had World War II and the Holocaust in mind. So you can come up with quite a few national narratives when it comes to witch hunting. America, of course, with the Salem witch hunt, and it's very much the same story where you have McCarthyism in the 1950s, the famous Red Scare, leading to Arthur Miller's play The Crucible. And there you have another sort of story of a country grappling with its inner demons. So lots of countries have narratives about their witch hunt, and a lot of them are, in my view, quite problematic. I don't quite know where the Scottish narrative would fit in. I do think that there should be one, given that Scotland did, prosecute relatively a lot of witches compared to other countries. But yeah, maybe you guys have some thoughts on that.
It's so interesting what you say, Jan, about the way that the witchcraft trials are looked at by different people with different theories and overlaying their theories on it to fit. And do you know, I think actually in Scotland we have had so little chat at a broad social level. I mean, obviously there's an academic conversation going on, but at a broad social level, I don't think there is a general narrative. At least I'm not aware of it. I mean, we could perhaps ask Professor Goodyear if he'll have a chat with us again and see whether or not he thinks there's one. Zoe, what do you think? I mean, I think people are just utterly amazed when they find out how much, when they don't really have a narrative over it.
I think the narrative, and I'm not a historian, so this maybe isn't quite what Jan's meaning, but I think the narrative that we have in Scotland is that it's that one about the red-haired, left-handed, feisty women being pushed down by, and people get this wrong all the time, particularly the Catholic Church, which is obviously completely erroneous. But people, I think, have melded together to a great extent the issue that women might hold with the Catholic Church about things like, like mother and baby homes and that sort of thing, and sort of mashed that together with the witch trials and have gone, well, who's the most sort of controlling of women's rights religious wise? Catholics. So they must be, I'm not saying that they are, I'm saying that that's what a perception can be. Then, so they've sort of put that together wrongly, that it's bold women that have been put down by the Catholic Church, and if not the Catholic Church, and just like church generally, and that it's men generally. And I think that's what the Scottish narrative is, that these are women who, if they'd been allowed to live, could have cured cancer. But because they were struck down, and before they've even got grey hair and their red hair quite often, they were unable to fulfill their promise. Because I often see women writing that and saying, just think of all the knowledge that we've lost with the murder of these women. And we know that it's unlikely that there was a very big percentage of women happened to be midwives and so on, because they were really useful to society. So they weren't generally accused. And that if they did, we know from the research that's been done, we've been told by other historians that if women were accused of being witches and they were midwives or whatever, usually that wasn't really the reason that they were accused. Like that was like a secondary thing. It was something else they'd done, except for cases sometimes where maybe a child had died, say, and they were looking to blame somebody for that. But I think that is the Scottish story, is that it's women tramped down by the church.
Yeah, and can I ask, is there other countries that have that narrative about feisty women standing up to the patriarchy? As far as you're aware, do other countries have that idea?
No, it doesn't ring a bell with me. Perhaps people hearing this podcast will sort of like call in and correct me. But Zoe's description very much rings true for me, because I was, in preparation of writing my piece for the conversation, listening to that BBC Scotland podcast series from 2019 about the Scottish witch hunt, and it had lots of amazing material, but it was also interspersed with sort of discussions about sort of like here in Scotland we have these sort of like loudmouths, Scottish women who don't do as they're told, and that's why they are being prosecuted for witchcraft.
It's kind of an irresistible narrative, that it's sort of taking you as the victim and recasting you as like the underdog that you will get their day. I think it's a really irresistible, like I'm a writer of fiction, so I can completely see why people would grasp onto that as a plot line. It's kind of like, well, it's that whole, we're the granddaughters of the women you couldn't burn, which makes no logical sense anyway, because if you couldn't burn them, are you saying that there weren't witches? So these are women that escaped accusations of witchcraft, in which case I don't really understand what the logic is like at all with that saying. It's really, really bizarre. But I think I can completely see why people grasp onto it, because it's like, you might think, I feel a bit powerless today in 2022, so I'm going to grasp that magic power from 300 years ago and impose that upon myself and say, I will get my day, and like a phoenix will rise from the ashes. And I'm aware that's various different metaphors scrambled together. But I think that's what the thinking is.
Yeah, as historians, I think this is another point, maybe implicit in my op-ed, was the idea that we need to resist sort of appropriations. If we can use the early modern witch hunt to foster reflection about what we do ourselves today, then that's good. If we, on the other hand, sort of say, I own the Scottish witch hunt because I am a Wiccan, or because I'm a woman, or because I am Donald Trump and I'm being prosecuted unjustly. I mean, because like he uses that language about being the victim of a witch hunt all the time.
Male politicians use it all the time, whilst also being perfectly comfortable with accusing female politicians of being witches. Again, the logic fails me on that one.
Yeah, no, it's really problematic. So there is, of course, a fine line between, sort of like us collectively using the witch hunt and individual groups within society appropriating the witch hunt. And I don't quite know where that line is, but like, I think, Zoe, your point there is an excellent one. I think the other point that sort of follows on from that is sort of that, and this is another reason why I'm slightly uncomfortable with apologies, is sort of that it then also creates the idea that, yes, these women were innocent of the crime of witchcraft. That doesn't necessarily turn them into martyrs for anything in particular. it also doesn't turn them into saints who've done nothing wrong, right? And that should make sense because they were among the most marginalized people in society. You don't get by on a day-to-day basis being a saint in those circumstances.
I don't disagree. I think that we shouldn't make people into saints that weren't saints.
Oh, I completely agree with that.
But I don't think we have to. I think that what we can do is say these were ordinary, complex folk in Scotland who lived, who loved, who hated, who laughed, who cried, who committed offences. But the real one offence they definitely didn't commit was the offence of witchcraft. And that was what they lost their lives for.
We're really specific about that, aren't we? That's all that we're looking for. We're looking at one area because sometimes the men that have got critical feedback for us say, well, how do we know they weren't guilty of something? I'm like if it was murder and they were done for that, then that's a completely separate issue. This is about people that were accused and convicted often of witchcraft. That's all we're talking about. We're not talking broadly.
That's just my favourite. But they might have been guilty of something else. And what?
So might you, Jim Partick. What's your point?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think I completely agree with you both there. It's they lived lives. Some of my students and I, at Cardiff we have year-long modules, so we spend 20 weeks going through the early modern witch hunt, and we read a lot of witchcraft files, and some cases are absolutely tragic. One of the cases we looked at is the story of a 20-year-old girl. She's 20, so she's an adult, but she seems to have the mental acuity of a child, who seems to just be prosecuted for witchcraft by her own father because he remarried someone else, and his new family is dying, and he suspects his oldest daughter of somehow being envious and somehow being responsible for it. So there are some really, really tragic.
That's not in isolation, because I've read a couple of ones that were like that, where it's a father that's remarried that blames an earlier iteration of family for things that have happened to his new family, which is really interesting to me, because you would think that you wouldn't want to bring that shame upon yourself, but then maybe it's kind of a double bluff where you say, I'm that godly, I will accuse my own daughter to keep right with God. So the heavenly world is more important to me than the physical world. That's really interesting. Oh, how awful.
Yeah, no, there are some terrible cases like that one as well that you were describing, Zoe. But there are also cases when we read the record where it's clear that the people who were accused of witchcraft, they were not saints. They engaged in village quarrels. The people that accused them also had grievances. They were as much human beings as the people that they ended up being the victims of the witch hunt. And that doesn't justify what those accusers did in the slightest, but it should sort of lead us to sort of reflect on sort of the complexities here. You could also be incredibly aggressive, and as a result of your aggression, be accused of witchcraft. And that doesn't necessarily justify the witchcraft accusation, but it sort of does explain it. And so there are tens of thousands of untold tragedies lying underneath the statistics of the witch hunt. And so some of them are absolutely horrifying. Others are sad, but understandable. But they're all different. And yes, there are commonalities, of course, for instance, the issue of gender. And of course, all this brings us back to the issue of narratives and how it's just an impossible task to place on the shoulders of Scotland's first minister to sort of condense all of this in the span of just a few minutes. But, in order for us to sort of think about witchcraft, I think we need things like a memorial where we can reflect about the individuals as well and have space to discuss the different aspects, because we cannot really create a single narrative. Having a site that fosters reflection and creates the possibility of a plurality of narratives that can sit side by side with each other or can be in debate with each other. I think that is really where we should be going. And that's why I think your campaign about having an official national monument for the Witches of Scotland feels like a really, really positive thing. I mean, one thing, and of course, I really hope you'll get there soon, and I really hope that the Scottish state will cough up the money, because I think that would also sort of send a strong symbol if it was, this is the money from everyone. I
think that is a really important point to make, because that's why we're pushing for not just saying a memorial, but a state memorial, because we think it's really important that the state does pay for it in the same way that the state would pay for, like a war memorial or any other sort of big national issue like that. And I think that's really important because the money from the state comes from everybody obviously paying their taxes. And it's a tiny, tiny bit of your taxes that would go towards things like statuary. But I think it is something really important because it shores up like a version of part of our national identity and where we want to go and who we were and who we are now. I think that's really, really important.
And also make sure that the past is then not forgotten, right? It's a visible, marker of the past and the present. When you get to that stage, though, I would encourage you to think about what that monument should look like, because that is, it should be open, I think, to interpretation and open to multiple narratives. And if it's going to be just, a giant-sized woman, wearing a broomstick.
Sorry, we're saying no. Like we're like no. Obviously we don't have any. If we get it in principle, we don't have any control over what it would look like. But Zoe and I have both said very strongly. But I think, in fact, Zoe said it best. She said, "I don't want a winsome woman looking out to sea." That's it.
With her skirts blowing around her. That sort of, to use the vernacular in Scotland, I don't know, Jan, if you have an equivalent in Cardiff or in Holland, but it gives me the boke. I have to be honest. It really makes me feel ill. The thought of it just being represented as a bonny girl, just kind of like, I just don't think that's cool. I've said, so many times, Claire and I have said to each other, we're not going to build this memorial. It's got nothing to do with us. But obviously I hold opinions about it as I do about everything. But I think that it should be something I'd like to see a Scottish artist make something that's really like with light or sound or, just something that's really different and unusual. And quite some time ago, Claire and I spoke, not on the podcast, I don't think. We had a conversation with an artist who had pointed us to things that had been done in different places around the world, who had memorialized events, not about the witch hunts necessarily in their countries, but had memorialized events in ways that were really kind of provocative and didn't push you down a narrative and did what I think you're talking about, which is to think a bit more about humanity rather than, being, whatever the fiction possibly is in that country.
Yeah, I'm excited. I really hope you guys get there and you'll get there sooner rather than later. I'll be there at the opening. Well, if there are tickets, I'll try and get one.
Again, we have to say for the record, not that Claire and I would necessarily have anything to do with that, but if we have to, I'll build it myself. I will.
And I'll stand
an artist, obviously, but
Yeah, I'll stand at the gate and collect the tickets. That's what we'll do. Jan, you can help me. Jan, thank you so much for giving your time to speak to us about these subjects. And we think that the piece that you wrote is really thoughtful, and indeed it is really thoughtful what you've explained to us, that we're not off the hook yet, and there are a myriad of narratives that we still have to think about. And that's one thing that's so fascinating to us about the witchcraft trials, that there are all these different narratives. So we're going to keep talking. We're going to keep talking to experts, and we hope that the more we speak to people, the more we banish the false narratives and we try and get some true and interesting stories. So thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a real honor.
Thanks for joining us for episode 57 of the Witches of Scotland podcast. You guys, you're lifers. We're all in this together. We're just going to keep going until the bitter end. I'm being silly. Obviously, it's a pleasure. And actually, I should have mentioned before, Claire, that we've got some interesting potential stuff coming up with the other parts of our campaign. So I'm going to do that really annoying thing of saying to you, we've got some news, but we can't share it yet. But we will keep you posted as it goes. But suffice to say, there's some quite interesting stuff happening that hopefully is going to end up with some exciting news to reveal at a later date.
So what you're saying is there's some exciting things that are going to end up in exciting things sometime in the future at some point.
Excitingly, yes. That is exactly what I'm saying.
I'm glad we flagged that up for everybody.
Yes. I just want people to know that things are still happening behind the scenes, so that we're working away, but we're not in a position to tell anybody the details of it just now.
No, I should actually say we were hoping by this stage that the consultation document would be out. I think I said last time that it would be, these things are just subject to their own timescales and their own vagaries, so it's not actually out yet, but it is in the pipeline.
So that's good too.
As soon as it comes out, we will let you know. there's something else that we'll be able to tell you about soon, which is a whole region has got in contact with us, a region abroad. They have again been inspired by the idea of our campaign and the campaign in Catalonia, and they are looking into their own witches pardon and or memorial. So we will update you with that hopefully next week if we've got a bit more information on that, and again get somebody on from over there and they'll be able to tell us about the podcast.
Don't forget about the I Write event. That's the 21st of May, and we'll put up links for tickets on Twitter and in other places too. But please, mentioning Twitter, please do follow us, chat to us on Twitter. That's the best place where we can actually have communication because we're on there the most. But we've also got a Facebook page, and we have got Instagram where we've got lots of people getting in touch with us. And Claire's got 2 TikToks that she's done. So that's worth checking out, that extensive archive.
Listen, I'm going to make you, so we're recording here today, but the Powers of Magic, we're actually doing an event later today, which we won't tell you about because it will just upset the timeline. So the next TikTok we'll be doing is very soon, because I'm going to force Zoe to do a TikTok with me, and you're going to see one of the world's most reluctant TikTokers.
Oh, right. Okay. That's annoying. I'm not doing it.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, look forward to speaking to you soon.
Okay. See you later. Bye.
Bye.
If you'd like to learn more about the Witches of Scotland, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Sign up for our mailing list at www.witchesofscotland.com to keep updated with the campaign. On that site, you'll be able to find how to link with us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram.